Phantom Phone Lines Season 0, the show featuring carefully crafted, dramatized, voicemail message-style stories of unsettling, surreal, and perhaps paranormal encounters. Without further ado, let's hear what's been left on the line.
I wouldn't call this a ghost story, at least not confidently. It's more like a collection of things that happened over several months. Each thing by itself was easy to dismiss. Together, well, together they're the reason I'm calling. This happened about 8 years ago. At the time, I was working part-time as a security guard. It wasn't my career. It was just a job. I was trying to pay off some debt and save a little money while figuring out what I wanted to do long-term. Security work isn't glamorous. Most of the time, it's paperwork, walking, and staying awake. But it paid better than a lot of other part-time jobs, so I stuck with it. The thing about being new in security is that nobody wants to give you the good assignments. The experienced guards got the easy jobs. The office parks during the day, the corporate campuses with cafeterias and receptionists, the places where people smiled and said hello. The new guys got the leftovers. Night shifts, weekend shifts, holiday shifts, construction sites, vacant buildings, places nobody wanted to sit alone. I got all of those. Some of the assignments were honestly depressing. I once spent an entire weekend guarding an empty warehouse that contained nothing except stacks of unused shelving. 48 hours of staring at concrete walls. Another time I worked a construction site where the most exciting thing that happened was a raccoon knocking over a trash can. So when I got assigned to a downtown office building, I was actually relieved. At least it was indoors. At least it had heat and air conditioning. At least there were functioning bathrooms. The building was 12 stories tall, built sometime in the 70s. Brown brick exterior, narrow windows. The kind of architecture that probably looked modern when it was new, but now just looked tired. The lobby had marble floors that had long since lost their shine. The elevators were old but functional. Everything worked. Nothing felt updated. The building wasn't abandoned. Far from it. Several businesses still occupied offices there. Law firms, insurance companies, accountants, consultants. The usual collection of businesses that fill office towers. During the day, it felt completely normal. People coming and going, ringing. Conversations in hallways. Coffee brewing somewhere. But after dark, it became a different place. By 9 o'clock, most tenants had gone home. By 10, entire floors were empty. By midnight, the building felt enormous. Not because it physically changed, because silence changes your perception of space. A hallway with people in it feels ordinary. The same hallway completely empty at 1 in the morning feels endless. You start noticing sounds, the hum of ventilation systems, the clicking of pipes, the groan of metal expanding and contracting. Things most people never pay attention to. I started my first shift there on a Tuesday. The property manager gave me a tour. He showed me the loading dock, the mechanical rooms, the emergency exits, the electrical closets, the rooftop access. Standard stuff. Then we reached the 9th floor. I remember this clearly because it was the only part of the tour where he volunteered information without me asking. He said, "Nobody rents this floor." That was it. Just those 4 words. Nobody rents this floor. At the time, I barely registered it. Vacant office space isn't unusual. Businesses move, leases expire, floors sit empty. Perfectly normal. Still, when we stepped onto floor 9, I noticed something immediately. The atmosphere felt different. The occupied floors felt lived in. There were desks, pictures, coffee mugs, office supplies, evidence of people. Floor 9 had none of that. Most of the furniture had been removed. The carpet was faded. Dust collected in corners. Several ceiling tiles were missing. Old conference rooms sat empty. The place felt frozen in time. Not abandoned exactly, just forgotten. I remember joking that it looked like the setting of a horror movie. The property manager laughed, but looking back, there was something strange about the laugh. Not nervous, not scared, just forced. Like he'd heard the joke before, many times. My first few weeks were uneventful. The routine became familiar. Check entrances, walk floors, monitor cameras, document anything unusual, repeat. Most nights passed quietly. Then I noticed the elevator. The first time it happened, I didn't think anything of it. One of the elevators traveled from the lobby to floor 9 around 11:30 at night. The doors opened, waited, closed, then returned. Nobody entered. Nobody exited. I assumed somebody upstairs had accidentally called it. End of story. The next night it happened again. Same floor, same elevator, roughly the same time. Still not especially strange. Old elevators malfunction, buttons stick, sensors fail. No mystery. Then it happened again and again and again. Always 9. Never 8, never 10, always 9. Eventually curiosity got the better of me. One night I decided to investigate. When the elevator made its trip, I rode another elevator upstairs. The doors opened. The hallway stretched away beneath dim lights, empty, silent. I walked the entire floor, every office, every conference room, every storage area. Nothing. No people. No signs of intrusion. No explanation. I was halfway back toward the elevator when I heard it. A chair scraping. Just once. A quick dragging sound, like somebody pulling a chair away from a table. The sound came from somewhere behind me. I spun around immediately. Nothing. The hallway remained empty. The sound never repeated. I checked every room nearby. Nothing. At the time, I blamed the building. Old buildings make strange noises. Simple, reasonable, problem solved. Except the sounds kept happening. Not every night, just often enough. A chair moving, papers rustling, a door closing softly, footsteps, normal office sounds. That's what made them unsettling. Not because they were frightening, because they sounded ordinary. If I'd heard chains rattling or strange whispers, I'd have immediately dismissed it as imagination. Instead, I kept hearing the kinds of sounds you'd expect from people quietly working late, except nobody was supposed to be there. One night around 1 in the morning, I decided to sit on floor 9 for a while. Partly out of curiosity, partly because I was tired of wondering. I brought a folding chair, picked a spot near an old conference room, and waited. The building felt different up there, hard to explain, not spooky, just disconnected, like standing inside a place that had fallen out of use but hadn't realized it yet. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened. Then I heard voices, very faint, like 2 people talking, maybe 3. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of conversation, low, professional, calm, the kind of discussion you'd hear during a late-night meeting. The moment I stood up, the voices stopped, instantly, not faded, stopped. The silence afterward felt enormous. I searched the entire floor again. Nothing, nobody. Months later, that still wasn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part happened on the cameras. One night, I watched the elevator arrive at floor 9. The doors opened and stayed open. Longer than normal, 5 seconds, 10, 15, 20. As if somebody invisible was standing in the doorway holding them. Eventually, they closed. The elevator descended. I replayed the footage multiple times. Same result every time. When I showed it to one of the veteran guards the next morning, he didn't laugh. He didn't even seem surprised. Instead, he stared at the screen and quietly asked, "That floor again?" That answer bothered me more than anything I'd experienced, because it suggested I wasn't the first person noticing strange things. And over the next few weeks, I started learning that maybe I wasn't. The cleaning crew avoided 9 whenever possible. One janitor refused to work the floor alone. Another told me he'd occasionally hear phones ringing up there despite the fact that all the phone lines had supposedly been disconnected. Nobody claimed to have seen ghosts. Nobody told dramatic stories. But there was a pattern. people got uncomfortable when Floor 9 came up in conversation, like they had experiences they preferred not to discuss. The longer I worked there, the more I noticed little things. Conference room chairs that seemed slightly different than I remembered, a door that I was certain had been closed appearing open later, a light turned on in a room that should have had no power. Tiny things. The kind of things memory can easily distort. That's why I never wrote them up. I couldn't prove any of them. But they accumulated. And eventually I found myself dreading patrols on that floor. Not because I thought something would happen. Because I never knew whether I'd spend the next hour questioning my memory afterward. Then one night something happened that finally convinced me to stop investigating. Around 2 in the morning, I was walking the far end of Floor 9. The hallway was completely empty. The building was silent. I remember passing an old conference room. The door was partially open. Inside sat a long table and several chairs. Nothing unusual. I continued down the hallway. Maybe 30 seconds later, I heard that familiar scraping sound. A chair moving. This time directly behind me. I turned immediately. The conference room door was still open. Everything appeared normal. But one chair at the end of the table was no longer pushed in. It sat slightly angled away from the table. Maybe it had always been that way. Maybe I simply hadn't noticed. Honestly, that's the most likely explanation. But standing there alone at 2 in the morning, after months of strange incidents, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That was the moment I stopped trying to solve the mystery. A few weeks later, my assignment ended. Another guard took over. I moved on, and life continued. To this day, I don't know what was happening in that building. Maybe faulty elevators, maybe acoustics, maybe exhaustion, maybe confirmation bias, maybe dozens of ordinary explanations combining into something that felt extraordinary. I hope that's the answer. I really do. But every now and then when I step into an office building now, I still think about Floor 9. I think about that elevator opening onto an empty hallway, waiting as though somebody was stepping inside. And I think about all those ordinary office sounds drifting through a place where nobody should have been. Honestly, I still don't know what to make of it. Anyway, that's my story. Bye.
Hi. I've been listening to your show for a few months now, and every time somebody calls in with a UFO story, I usually find myself sitting there thinking of all the possible explanations before they even finish talking. Maybe that sounds rude. I don't mean it that way. I've just always been the kind of person who looks for ordinary explanations first. I think that's partly because of how I was raised. My parents were practical people. Not cynical exactly, but practical. If the house creaked, it was settling. If you heard something outside at night, it was probably a raccoon. If you saw a strange light in the sky, it was probably an airplane. There was always an explanation. Most of the time, they were right. And honestly, that's still how I approach things today. I'm not somebody who believes every mysterious story I hear. I don't spend my evenings watching UFO documentaries. I don't assume aliens are visiting Earth. I don't think every unexplained event has a supernatural cause. In fact, the reason this experience bothers me is because I can't quite fit it into any explanation that completely satisfies me. Not because it was dramatic. Actually, the opposite. Nothing spectacular happened. There were no missing hours, no strange beings, no flashing lights, no messages from beyond the stars. Just a light. A single light. And maybe that's why it has stayed with me, because it was so simple. Simple enough that I should have been able to explain it. Yet somehow I never did. This happened during my second year of graduate school. I was living alone, surviving primarily on coffee, anxiety, and whatever food happened to be cheapest that week. If you've ever gone through graduate school, you probably understand. There's this strange period where every day feels like a balancing act. You're constantly aware of deadlines. Even when you're relaxing, you're thinking about the work you should be doing. Every project feels important. Every mistake feels catastrophic. Looking back now, I realize I was under far more stress than I admitted at the time. I thought I was handling it. In reality, I was exhausted almost constantly. I lived in an old brick apartment building near campus. The building had probably been beautiful at one point, maybe in the 1920s. By the time I moved in, it had developed what landlords like to call character, which is usually another way of saying old. The floors creaked, the radiators hissed, the windows rattled during windstorms, the plumbing made strange noises at random hours. The building always smelled faintly of old books and dust. It wasn't glamorous, but it was affordable. And for a graduate student, affordable wins every time. My apartment overlooked a small courtyard shared by several neighboring buildings. In spring and summer, it was actually quite nice. There were benches, a few trees. People occasionally sat outside reading or eating lunch. During winter, though, the courtyard became something entirely different. The benches disappeared beneath snow. The trees stood bare and skeletal. Everything turned gray and white. The whole space felt abandoned. Frozen. Still. The winter this happened was particularly brutal. Weeks of cold weather. Several snowstorms. Temperatures that seemed determined to remain below freezing. The city looked tired. Everybody looked tired. You'd walk across campus and see people hurrying between buildings with their heads down against the wind. Nobody lingered outside longer than necessary. Nobody wanted to be there. The night this happened was during one of those storms. Not a blizzard, nothing historic, just a steady snowfall that had been building throughout the evening. The sort of storm where the snow never really stops. It just keeps falling hour after hour, softly, relentlessly. I had a major paper due later that week. Naturally, I'd waited far too long to finish it, so I spent the evening at my desk, reading articles, taking notes, deleting paragraphs, writing new paragraphs, then deleting those too, the usual process. By 10 o'clock, I was already frustrated. By 11, I was questioning my life choices. By midnight, I was on my second pot of coffee and accomplishing almost nothing. Outside the window, snow drifted past beneath the courtyard lights. I found myself watching it more than I was working. Snow has always had that effect on me, especially at night. There's something mesmerizing about it. The way it changes sound, the way it changes light, the way it transforms familiar places into something unfamiliar. Every so often, I'd catch myself staring out the window for several minutes at a time. Then I'd force myself back to work. Then I'd drift back toward the window again. Around midnight, I got up to refill my coffee mug. I remember stretching and looking at the clock. I remember thinking how tired I felt. I remember considering whether I should simply go to bed and deal with the paper in the morning. Eventually, I walked into the kitchen, filled my mug, stood there for a minute staring at nothing, then returned to my desk. And that's when I noticed something different. At first, I couldn't identify what had changed. The room looked the same. The courtyard looked the same. Yet something felt off. The sensation lasted only a second or two. Then my eyes found it. A light, hanging beyond the snowfall. At first, I assumed it was a reflection. That's important. I didn't think UFO. I didn't think mystery. I thought reflection. The orb appeared almost perfectly circular. Bright white. Not harsh, not blinding, just bright. A steady glow suspended somewhere beyond the courtyard. I glanced around the room looking for the source. Desk lamp, computer monitor, kitchen light, something. Nothing obvious jumped out at me. Still, reflections happen. Old windows produce strange effects, particularly at night. So I wasn't concerned. I sat down, went back to work. A few minutes later, I looked up again. The light was still there, exactly where I'd left it. That caught my attention. Not because it was unusual, because it was persistent. Reflections often shift slightly as you move. This one didn't seem to. I stood and approached the window. The orb remained motionless. Outside, snowflakes swirled in every direction. The wind pushed them sideways. The trees moved. Everything moved. Except the light. The stillness bothered me, more than the brightness, more than the shape. Just the stillness. It felt detached from everything around it, like it belonged to a different scene. I spent several minutes studying it, trying to judge distance, trying to understand what I was seeing. And that's where the snow became important. Heavy snowfall destroys depth perception. You lose visual reference points. Objects become difficult to place. The orb appeared beyond the courtyard. But how far beyond? I couldn't tell. It might have been hovering over a nearby rooftop. It might have been much farther away. The snow obscured everything behind it. The longer I watched, the stranger the visual effect became. Snowflakes remained clearly visible throughout the courtyard, thousands of tiny white streaks moving through yellow lamplight. Yet whenever they crossed in front of the orb, they seemed to fade, almost disappear. Not completely, just enough to notice. I remember blinking repeatedly, rubbing my eyes, looking away and back. The effect remained. Again, there are probably perfectly ordinary optical explanations. Bright backgrounds affect contrast. Human perception is imperfect. But standing there alone at midnight, the effect felt unsettling. Not frightening, just wrong. Time passed. 10 minutes. 15. Maybe more. The orb never changed, never blinked, never flickered, never altered brightness. It simply remained there. Watching isn't quite the right word, but that's how it felt, as though it possessed a presence beyond simply being a light. Eventually, I began testing my reflection theory. I moved left. The orb stayed put. I moved right. Nothing changed. I crouched, stood, backed away, approached, still there. Then I began turning lights off. First the kitchen, then the lamp. Eventually, only my computer monitor illuminated the room. The orb remained. At that point, I remember feeling genuinely puzzled. Not scared, just puzzled. Because every explanation I generated seemed to immediately develop problems, and I hate problems without solutions. The apartment had become incredibly quiet. The radiator hissed occasionally. Snow tapped softly against the glass. Otherwise, silence. The kind of silence that only exists during winter storms. The world outside seemed distant, muted, like everything had been wrapped in blankets. Then the light moved. At first I wasn't sure. The motion was almost imperceptible, so subtle that I questioned myself immediately. I stared, waited, and slowly realized it was drifting sideways, not floating randomly, not wobbling, gliding, smoothly, steadily, as though following an invisible path. The movement was so controlled that it somehow felt stranger than if it had shot across the sky. There was no drama, no acceleration, no spectacle, just deliberate motion. The orb continued drifting for several minutes, then entered a thicker curtain of snowfall. Its brightness softened, dimmed, and vanished. No flash, no explosion, no sudden departure. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. I remained at the window for nearly 20 minutes afterward, waiting. Nothing returned. Eventually I put on my coat and went downstairs. The courtyard was empty. Snow covered everything. The storm continued. The world looked completely ordinary. I searched the sky, the rooftops, the neighboring buildings, nothing. No explanation, just snow. I eventually returned upstairs, finished almost none of my paper, and went to bed. The next day I started rationalizing. By the end of the day, I'd nearly convinced myself it was a reflection. By the end of the week, I'd decided it was probably an atmospheric phenomenon. By the end of the month, I'd settled on exhaustion and stress. But every now and then, the memory returns, and the certainty fades again. Because what I remember most isn't the light itself. It's the feeling. The feeling of standing alone in that old apartment while snow fell endlessly outside. The feeling that for 30 minutes I was observing something I couldn't quite place into any familiar category. Maybe that's all it was. A misunderstanding, an illusion, a tired brain trying to make sense of unusual conditions. Honestly, I hope that's true, but I can still picture that orb perfectly, suspended beyond the snowfall, silent, motionless, patient. as though it had nowhere else to be. Anyway, that's my story. Maybe somebody listening has an explanation. If so, I'd genuinely love to hear it, because even as a skeptic, I still find myself looking out windows and wondering what exactly I was looking at that night.
Hi. I've been going back and forth about whether to call for months. Not because I'm afraid people won't believe me. Honestly, I don't know that I completely believe it myself. I think that's part of the reason it stays with me. If I'd seen something obvious, something undeniably supernatural, I could at least put it into a category. I could say, this happened. Instead, what I have is a memory, a strange memory. One that becomes harder to explain the more I think about it. I grew up in a small village in Western Ireland. Not tiny enough that everybody knew everybody else's business, but close. The sort of place where old stories still linger. Not because people necessarily believe them, at least not openly, but because they're woven into everyday life. There were places you didn't build on, fields people avoided after dark, old hawthorn trees nobody wanted to cut down, ring forts left untouched in the middle of farmland. Even people who laughed at fairy stories tended to leave those things alone, just in case. My grandmother was very much from that generation. She wasn't what I'd call superstitious, at least not in the way people imagine. She didn't claim to see ghosts. She didn't tell dramatic stories. She didn't talk about curses or magic. Instead, she treated certain beliefs almost like safety rules. Things sensible people simply did, or didn't do. You didn't disturb fairy trees, you didn't interfere with old forts, and if you saw lights moving across the fields at night, you minded your own business. I heard that one several times growing up. Usually after I'd asked too many questions. Whenever I pushed for details, she'd simply say, "Not every road belongs to us." I never knew exactly what she meant. As a teen, I didn't care much either. Like most teenagers, I thought I knew better than old stories. I respected my grandmother. I loved her. But I assumed those beliefs belonged to a different time, a time before electricity, before cars, before people understood how the world worked. Then came the storm. It wasn't particularly historic. Just one of those winter storms that roll in off the Atlantic. Heavy wind, cold rain, power lines down, roads flooded. The sort of weather everyone complains about but eventually forgets. The electricity went out shortly after sunset. The entire village went dark. Back then, power outages weren't uncommon during bad weather. Usually they lasted an hour or two, sometimes longer. That evening, nobody seemed especially concerned. My grandmother lit candles. My grandfather found an old battery-powered radio. We settled into the sitting room and waited. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Rain tapped against the glass. The house creaked occasionally. It actually felt rather cozy, at first. A couple hours passed. Still no electricity. The radio eventually died. The batteries gave up. That left us with candlelight and conversation. There's something strange about power outages. Without televisions or phones, people talk differently. Slower. Longer. Stories emerge. Memories. Things that normally stay buried beneath everyday distractions. My grandparents began talking about people I'd never met. Neighbors who'd passed away years earlier. Relatives. Old village characters. The kinds of stories families carry forward. Eventually, the rain started easing. The wind weakened. The silence outside became more noticeable. I remember standing up to stretch. The candles flickered behind me. The room felt warm, comfortable. I wandered toward the front window, mostly out of boredom. Outside, the countryside was almost completely dark. No streetlights, no house lights, nothing. Without electricity, the village seemed transformed. The darkness felt deeper than normal, older somehow. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out fields beyond the road, Stone walls, hedgerows, familiar shapes. Then I noticed a light, far away, just a single point at first, moving slowly across one of the distant fields. My first thought was a flashlight, maybe a farmer checking livestock after the storm. Perfectly reasonable. Then I noticed another light, and another, and another. A line of them, perhaps a dozen, maybe more. They moved steadily across the landscape. Not quickly, not erratically. Slowly, purposefully. I remember calling my grandfather over. He joined me at the window. I pointed toward the lights. For a few moments he simply watched. Then he frowned. Not frightened, just thoughtful. My grandmother stood as well. The moment she saw them, her expression changed. I still remember it clearly. Recognition. Immediate recognition. The way someone reacts to something they've seen before, or heard about many times. The lights continued moving. Each one glowed with a warm yellow color. Not bright white like flashlights. Not harsh like vehicle headlights. They looked old. That's the best word I can find. Like lanterns. Actual lanterns. The sort you'd see in historical photographs. At first I tried counting them, but they seemed to drift in and out of view behind hedges and rises in the land. Sometimes I saw 6, sometimes 12, sometimes more. The strangest thing was their formation. They weren't scattered randomly. They moved in a loose procession, as though following a route, a path. I remember saying something about villagers carrying lamps, maybe people checking storm damage, maybe a search party, maybe a community event I'd forgotten about. My explanations sounded weaker the longer I spoke, because even then they didn't make much sense. Who would organize something like that during a storm? Why were there no vehicle lights, no flashlights, no reflective clothing, just lanterns, moving quietly through distant fields? Then my grandmother spoke, very calmly. She said, "Close the curtains." I laughed. I actually laughed. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Her expression remained completely serious. "Close them." I asked why. The answer she gave has stayed with me ever since. She said, "Because if they're looking for someone, you don't want them choosing you." The room suddenly felt colder. Not because of anything supernatural, because I'd never heard her speak that way before. There was no humor in her voice, no exaggeration. She sounded genuinely concerned. My grandfather didn't argue. That bothered me. Normally he rolled his eyes whenever old folklore came up. This time he said nothing. He simply continued watching the lights. After a long moment, my grandmother closed the curtains herself. That should have ended the story. It almost did. We returned to our seats. The conversation changed. Eventually the power returned. The lights came back on. Life resumed. But I couldn't stop thinking about the lanterns or my grandmother's reaction. The next morning I asked her about them. At first she brushed the question aside. Eventually, after enough persistence, she told me what she'd heard growing up. According to old local beliefs, strange lantern lights occasionally appeared in the countryside. Not every year, not even every generation. They were said to travel old routes, ancient paths, roads that no longer existed. People called them different things depending on the region. Some claimed they were fairy processions. Others said wandering spirits. Others said they were simply stories invented to explain unexplained lights. My grandmother didn't claim any particular explanation. She simply repeated what she'd been told. Never follow them, never call out to them, never invite their attention. I asked whether she'd ever seen them before. She paused, then nodded. Once, when she was a child. The conversation ended there. Years have passed since then. I've looked into possible explanations. Atmospheric effects, distant vehicle lights, reflections, people carrying lamps. Every explanation seems possible, and honestly, one of them is probably correct. Memory isn't perfect. Distance distorts perception. Stories influence interpretation. I know all of that. But Here's the part I still can't explain. A few years later, while visiting again, I mentioned the incident to a local historian. I expected him to laugh. Instead, he asked where we'd seen the lights. I told him. He became very quiet. Then he told me something interesting. The field where we'd observed the lanterns wasn't always a field. 200 years earlier, an old road had crossed that exact area. A road abandoned long before modern maps. A road almost nobody remembered. Almost. When I heard that, I immediately thought of my grandmother's words. Not every road belongs to us. Maybe the lanterns were ordinary. Maybe there was nothing supernatural about them. Maybe a line of distant lights happened to follow the same route as a forgotten road. Coincidences happen. They happen all the time. Still, every now and then, when I visit home and look across those dark fields at night, I find myself searching. Just for a moment, looking for a warm yellow light, moving slowly across the countryside, following a path nobody uses anymore. And if I ever see them again, I think I'll do exactly what my grandmother told me. I'll close the curtains. Anyway, that's my story. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I've started recording this message 3 different times now and deleted it every single time. Part of the reason is that I know how this sounds. The second people hear the words big cat and Australian bush, they immediately divide into 2 groups. One group already believes, the other group starts laughing. I've probably spent most of my life in that second group. That's the honest truth. I grew up here, not too far from the mountains, and if you've lived around this part of Australia long enough, you've heard the stories. Everybody has. The phantom cat stories. The stories about something large moving through the bush where no large cat is supposed to exist. You'll hear them from old farmers, from truck drivers, from campers, from retired park workers. From the bloke at the pub who's had one too many beers. You'll hear stories about livestock disappearing, tracks found in mud, eyes in the dark, shapes crossing roads at night. Most people treat those stories like local folklore, the same way Americans talk about Bigfoot. Interesting, fun, not necessarily real. That was always my opinion. I never gave the stories much thought. Then I had a weekend in the bush that I still can't fully explain. Now, before I get into it, I want to be clear. I am not calling to tell you I saw a monster. I am not claiming there are breeding populations of secret panthers hiding in the mountains. I don't know what I saw. Maybe I saw a feral cat. Maybe I misjudged distance. Maybe I experienced 3 completely unrelated events and connected them afterward because human beings are good at creating patterns. All of those explanations are possible. Honestly, they're probably more likely than anything supernatural. But this story has stayed with me for almost 15 years. And every time I think I've finally dismissed it, some little detail crawls back into my head. So here goes. This happened when I was 23. At the time, I was working in a warehouse outside Sydney. Nothing glamorous. Long shifts. Early mornings. Repetitive work. The sort of job where Friday afternoons feel like a victory. I was saving money, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and spending most weekends escaping into the bush whenever I could. That was pretty normal among my friends. A lot of young Aussie blokes grow up camping and fishing. It's almost a cultural instinct. You spend all week surrounded by people, traffic, schedules, and noise, and eventually you start craving the exact opposite. The bush offers that, or at least it used to. Back then, you could still disappear for a weekend and barely see another person. That's what I wanted. Just a couple days of quiet. A fishing rod. A campfire. Nothing complicated. Originally, my mate Liam was supposed to come along. We'd been planning the trip for weeks. but he got called into work at the last minute and bailed. I nearly cancelled. Then I decided to go anyway. I'd camped alone before. Actually, I enjoyed solo trips. No arguments about where to set up camp. No negotiating over what to do. No worrying whether everybody else was having fun. Just me. Looking back, if Liam had come along, this story might have ended very differently. Or maybe it wouldn't have become a story at all. I left before sunrise on Saturday. The drive took several hours. The further I got from the city, the lighter I felt. Traffic disappeared. Buildings thinned out. The air changed. Anybody who spends time in the Australian bush probably understands what I mean. There's a smell to it. Eucalyptus, dust, sun-warmed earth, something ancient, something uniquely Australian. The sort of smell that immediately tells you you're a long way from shopping centres and office buildings. Around midday, I stopped at a lookout overlooking a massive valley. I'd been there before. Nothing unusual about it. Just one of those places people pull over to stretch their legs and take photos. There wasn't another vehicle in sight. The silence struck me immediately. No engines. No voices. No distant machinery. Just wind. I walked to the railing and looked out. The view was incredible. Layer upon layer of forest stretching toward the horizon. Blue haze hanging over distant ridges. The sort of landscape that makes you feel very small. I stood there for several minutes. Then I noticed movement, far below. At first I ignored it. The valley was full of movement. Wind moved trees. Shadows shifted. Birds crossed clearings. Nothing unusual, but this movement felt deliberate, purposeful. I narrowed my eyes, trying to focus. The shape emerged from a line of trees and entered a clearing, and immediately my brain tried to categorize it. Dog. That was my first thought. Then it kept walking, and something felt wrong. The proportions weren't right. The movement wasn't right. It moved low to the ground, fluid, effortless, like every step had purpose. I remember leaning against the railing, staring, trying to estimate size. Distance can be deceptive in mountain country. Things appear larger or smaller than they really are. Maybe it wasn't as big as I thought. Maybe it was closer. Maybe farther. But my immediate impression was of a very large cat. Solid black. Long tail. Powerful shoulders. The animal crossed the clearing and entered another patch of trees. Then it vanished. Just like that. Gone. I stood there waiting, expecting it to reappear. It never did. After a minute I laughed. Actually laughed. Because my brain immediately went to those old panther stories. And that seemed ridiculous. I got back in the ute and continued driving. By the time I reached my campsite, I'd mostly convinced myself it was a trick of distance. Problem solved. Or so I thought. The campsite sat beside a small creek deep in the bush. Nothing fancy. No facilities. No designated camping area. Just a flat clearing I'd used before. Exactly the sort of place I liked. The nearest person could have been kilometres away. Maybe that's part of why what happened later bothered me so much. Because when you're truly alone in the bush, every unusual thing feels amplified. Every sound matters. Every movement matters. There's nobody nearby to compare experiences with. No second opinion. No reassurance. Just you and your own thoughts. I set up camp, cooked dinner, did a little fishing, watched the sun disappear behind the ridges. The first night was completely normal, peaceful, exactly what I'd wanted. The next day was much the same, fishing, reading, exploring nearby trails, relaxing. For most of Sunday, the animal at the lookout barely crossed my mind. Then sometime after dawn on Monday morning, everything changed. I woke early and walked toward the creek with a mug of coffee. The ground near the water was muddy from recent rain. That's where I noticed the tracks. At first glance, I assumed they belonged to a dog. The bush is full of dogs. People abandon them. They wander. Nothing unusual. Then I crouch down. The shape bothered me immediately. I've spent enough time outdoors to recognise common animal tracks. These were kangaroo, not wombat, not fox, not deer, not anything I expected. The prints were rounded, broad, distinct, and larger than any domestic cat track I'd ever seen. I followed them, not because I was scared, because I was curious. The tracks continued along the creek for perhaps 50 metres, sometimes clear, sometimes faint, always heading in the same direction. Then they reached rocky ground and vanished. I searched for nearly 20 minutes. Nothing. No more tracks. No clue where the animal had gone. And standing there, staring at those final prints, I remembered the shape in the valley. For the first time, the two events connected in my mind. I still wasn't thinking panther. Not really. Something feline. Something unexpected. That night brought the part of the story I think about most. Not the sighting, not the tracks, the sound. It was fully dark. I was sitting beside the fire. The kind of peaceful moment people imagine when they think about camping. Crackling flames, cool air, stars overhead. The valley across from camp looked like a wall of darkness. Then something screamed, not barked, not growled, not howled, screamed. The closest comparison I can make is a woman screaming in the distance. Except it wasn't human. There was something animal underneath it, something raw. The sound echoed across the valley, and every instinct in my body reacted. My stomach dropped. The hairs on my arms stood up. I felt cold instantly. The scream lasted only a few seconds. Then silence. Absolute silence. Even the insects seemed to stop. I sat frozen, listening, waiting, hoping I wouldn't hear it again. Part of me wanted a second scream, because if it happened twice, maybe I could identify it. Maybe I could convince myself it was a fox or another animal, but it never came. The silence afterwards somehow felt worse, like the bush itself was listening. Eventually normal sounds returned. The insects resumed. Leaves rustled. The world continued. But something had changed. The bush no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. Not haunted, not supernatural, just occupied, as though something was out there moving through the darkness beyond the firelight. Something I couldn't see. And wouldn't see. I slept badly that night. Every little sound woke me. Every crack of a branch seemed significant. By dawn, I was exhausted. I packed camp early and headed home. That should have been the end of it. Maybe it was. But even now, I still think about that weekend. I've returned to that region many times. Never saw the animal again. Never found tracks like those again. Never heard that scream again. I've talked to farmers since then. Hunters. Campers. People who've spent their entire lives in those mountains. Some have stories. Some don't. A surprising number of them don't laugh when the topic comes up. They simply shrug and say something along the lines of, "Wouldn't surprise me. I don't know what I saw. Honestly, I probably never will." Maybe it was a large feral cat. Maybe a trick of perspective. Maybe three unrelated experiences woven together by memory. Those explanations are reasonable. They're probably correct. But every now and then, when I'm driving through the mountains and looking out over those endless valleys, I remember that black shape crossing the clearing. Calm, confident, silent, like it belonged there. And I find myself wondering whether some local legends survive for a reason. Anyway, that's my story. Thanks for listening. And if anybody else has spent time out in the mountains and seen something they couldn't quite explain, I'd be interested to hear it.
Hey, yeah,
I've been debating whether to call this in. I know what it sounds like before I even say it, and I'm usually the guy who rolls his eyes at this kind of thing. But it's been sticking with me, and the longer I leave it alone, the less comfortable it feels. So, I'll just tell it the way it happened. I'm in my mid-40s. I live alone. Been that way for a while now. It's a small place, nothing fancy, just enough space. Bedroom, hallway, living room, kitchen. You can stand in the hallway and pretty much hear everything else in the house, which is part of why this bothers me. I keep a routine. I like routines. I get home, eat, maybe watch something, lock up, go to bed. Same time most nights. I'm not up late wandering around, I'm not inviting people over. Quiet life, and like I mentioned, I've had sleep paralysis before. Enough times that I understand it. Or at least, I understand it enough to not panic when it happens. Doctor explained it to me years ago. Brain wakes up before the body, you're stuck, sometimes you hallucinate sounds or shapes. It's not dangerous, just uncomfortable. Most of my episodes have been textbook. Wake up, can't move, maybe feel a little pressure, maybe think I see something in the corner of the room. Then it passes. No big story attached to it. That's why this one doesn't sit right. It started like any other night. Nothing out of the ordinary. I remember checking the locks before bed, front door, back door. I do that every night. I also always close my bedroom door. Not all the way sometimes, but enough that it sits in place. I don't like it open. Never have. I went to sleep around 11. Sometime in the night, I woke up, and right away, I knew what it was. That same locked-in feeling. Body heavy. No control over my arms or legs. Breathing shallow at first until you force yourself to slow it down. I remember thinking, all right, just ride it out. The room was dark, but not pitch black. There's a streetlight outside that leaks through the blinds, so you can make out the outline of things. The dresser, the edge of the doorframe, the ceiling fan above me. Nothing unusual. And then I heard something. At first, it was so faint I thought I imagined it. But then it came again. Footsteps. From the hallway. Now, here's the thing, I know what my house sounds like. I know every creak, every shift in the floorboards. When the house settles. It's random. Irregular. This wasn't that. This was deliberate. One step. Pause. Another step. Even spacing. Like someone walking with purpose. I remember telling myself immediately, this is part of the episode. Because that's what you're supposed to do. Don't engage with it. Don't give it anything. So I stayed still. Focused on breathing. But the steps kept coming. And they didn't sound distant or muffled. They sounded close. Like right outside my room. There's a moment where your logic starts to slip. Not completely, but enough that doubt creeps in. Because if it's just your brain, why does it sound so specific? The steps reached my door, and stopped. That pause. It's hard to describe. It wasn't just silence. It felt like attention. Like whatever had been moving had arrived somewhere and was now aware. Aware of me. I tried to move. Tried to force my hand, my fingers, anything. Nothing. Then I heard the door shift. Not a loud creak. Not dramatic. Just a soft movement. Like it had been pushed open a little further. And then the footsteps started again. Inside the room. Same pace. Same measured rhythm. Closing the distance. I couldn't turn my head to look, but I didn't need to. I could track it just by the sound. Across the floor. Straight to the bed. It stopped at the foot. Another pause. Longer this time. And in that pause, I had this overwhelming sense that something was standing there, deciding what to do next. Not confused. Not searching. Deciding. Then the mattress dipped. Near my feet. Slowly. Like weight being applied carefully. That's when everything in me shifted from this is an episode to this doesn't feel right. Because I've had pressure before. I know that sensation. This was different. This was movement. I felt the mattress respond in a way that made sense physically. The slight pull, the shift of balance. Something was climbing onto the bed. Not jumping. Not rushing. Slow. Controlled. From my feet. Moving upward. I could feel it through the mattress, through the sheets. The weight transferring, inch by inch. It paused at my legs. Then continued. And when it reached my chest, it settled. Heavy. Not crushing, but undeniable. Like a person sitting squarely on top of me. I tried to breathe steadily, but it was harder now, not because of pressure, but because of the awareness of it. And then I noticed something else. Breathing. Not mine. Mine was shallow, uneven. This was steady. Controlled. Close enough that it felt like it was just above me. Or leaning over me. I couldn't see it. That might have been the worst part. If I could have seen something, I might have been able to rationalize it as a visual hallucination. But this was everything but sight, sound, weight, presence. I don't know how long it lasted. Time stretches in those moments. Eventually, like it always does, something broke. A small movement in my fingers. Then my arm. Then suddenly I could pull in a full breath. And it was like a switch flipped. I could move. I sat up. The room was empty. The bed looked normal. No impressions. No shifting. Nothing. I turned on the light. Checked the room. Checked the hallway. Nothing. I stood there for a while, just trying to steady myself. And I went through the same process I always do. Explaining it. Sleep paralysis. Stronger episode. Brain filled in more detail this time. Sound, movement, weight. It happens. It can happen. I told myself that over and over until my breathing slowed down. Eventually, I turned the light off and laid back down. I didn't want to, but I did. And after a while, I fell asleep again. When I woke up in the morning, everything felt normal. Sunlight, quiet house, nothing lingering. It almost felt ridiculous that I'd been that shaken. Until I looked at the door. It was open. Not wide open, but definitely not where I leave it. And I always close it. Every night. Same way. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it. Trying to remember if I'd left it open. Trying to convince myself I must have. Because that's the only explanation that makes sense. But here's the problem. In every episode I've had before, nothing in the physical space changes. What happens in your head. The room stays the same. The door stays where it was. This time, something didn't match. So now, I do what I always do. I lean on the logical explanations. Maybe I forgot to close it. Maybe the latch didn't catch and it drifted open. Maybe my brain just built a more convincing experience than usual. All possible. All reasonable. But at night, when I'm lying there, waiting to fall asleep, I think about those steps. The way they sounded. Not random. Not confused. Intentional. Like whoever or whatever was making them knew exactly where I was, and didn't hesitate. I still sleep with the door closed. I check it, twice sometimes, and I haven't had another episode like that since. But I'll be honest, when I wake up in the middle of the night now, I don't just focus on my breathing anymore. I listen, just for a second, to see if there's anything out there. All right. That's my tale. Bye.
This episode is part of Season 0, featuring crafted tales inspired by folklore, urban legends, classic ghost stories, and the paranormal. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, don't forget to subscribe to Phantom Phone Line, and be sure to share this with a friend who loves the unusual and unexplained. If you want to catch up on previous episodes, check our website at www.phantomphoneline.com for links and more information. We've reached the end of the line for now, but remember to stay tuned and keep listening for the next one, here on Phantom Phone Line. Any views and opinions expressed are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's producers, affiliates, or sponsors. This content is intended for entertainmental purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice or services of any kind. Viewers and listeners should exercise caution, seek professional advice if needed, and are encouraged to draw their own conclusions. Viewer and listener discretion is advised. Some content may be disturbing, sensitive, or triggering to certain audiences. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations is purely coincidental. Some parts of this content may feature elements that were created, altered, enhanced, or modified using digital production tools, techniques, or other advanced production methods, including synthetic or automated processes. All content is the property of Phantom Phone Line and may not be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form without prior written consent.